Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the keynote session and final session of the day of the annual Student Sustainability Research Conference. For those who have been with us all day, I hope you found it as inspiring as I have. There's been so many things discussed, and hopefully you've learnt lots about new collaborations. The keynote speech is to be delivered by University Chancellor Professor Jane Francis. Jane is the director of the British Antarctic Survey, otherwise known as BAS. She's a prominent polar scientist and has conducted a lot of pioneering research with numerous expeditions to the Arctic and the Antarctic. She undertakes a wide range of international roles to promote the UK's polar interests. I'm so pleased that Jane is here today to share some of her experiences and talk to us about how sustainability links to her work and her experience through BAS. That'll include reflections on a recent visit to South Georgia, and also to talk about the issues of plastic pollution, which is very close to us as an institution, having just made our 2023 End Single-Use Plastic Pledge. So, I know you don't want to listen to me, so if you would like to join me in welcoming Dame Frances onto the stage, thank you.
Thank you very much. I am absolutely delighted to be here. And as Louise said, I've just been to South Georgia in the South Atlantic, so this is a really great opportunity for me to talk about my travels and show you my travel slides. But actually, there is a very serious element to this, and it is about sustainability. And what I'm going to show you are three examples of sustainability, if you like. One about the plastics, which all of you youngsters in the audience, it's your challenge for the future, I think, to solve this really terrible problem. Secondly, a sustainability of some animals, which is going the right way. And thirdly, I'm going to show you a scheme of sustainability that works exceptionally well and how important it is to use scientific data to ensure that sustainability is rigorous. So let's go to South Georgia. So just to set the scene, here's where I'm going to talk about the continent of Antarctica. I'm not going to talk about the land in Antarctica, but more about the ocean around Antarctica, the Southern Ocean. And so it's a very deep, cold, but very fertile ocean around the continent. And then I've highlighted, you can hardly see it, but actually up there's a tiny speck of land, which is called South Georgia. And I'm a geologist, so I have to tell you, it originated as a sliver of rock from South America that you can see has been pushed to the right on the edge of a tectonic plate. And this is a satellite image of South Georgia, and it really is a very long slither of rock, some quite old and some younger, and it forms a really dramatic range of mountains in the ocean. It's 4 days sailing from the Falkland Islands, 4 days of hell for me, because I get terribly seasick, and then 4 days of paradise on this amazing island, and then you've got to get back again, which is the problem. But the mountains are quite spectacular. It's just like taking a piece of the Andes and plonking it in the middle of nowhere. And it really is quite remote, which is one of the benefits, and really dramatic. And not many people can go there. There are a few tourist ships that go there, mostly with photographers to look at the amazing animals. And I'm sure that all of you know about South Georgia, even if you don't recognize the name, because this is where David Attenborough goes. He sits with the albatross, which are really the sort of iconic species of South Georgia. And he sits with whales and blue whales. And he sits with hundreds of thousands of penguins that live on South Georgia. What you can't tell on TV, of course, is the smell of South Georgia, which is quite amazing, and the noise, because hundreds of thousands of penguins make an awful lot of squawky noise. And there are lots of seals as well. And if you see a nature program, Frozen Planet 2 or any of the Life on Earth series, when you see this sort of multitude of animals, you will see South Georgia. And so it's really important that this place is preserved intact for these very special ecosystems, and they are really protected from intruders, from other animals that could come here, and that they are allowed to live in their own ecosystem. Oh, and there's the seals. They look cute, don't they? But they're really smelly and they bite. So when you go there, you have to take some protection, and we had to walk in buddy pairs so that when one person kneels down to take a photo of the penguin, the other person's standing behind to make sure the seal doesn't bite your backside, because these little guys here have got very sharp, long teeth, and their mouth are full of the most horrible germs you can imagine. But the pups are quite sweet. So this is Bird Island in South Georgia, and you might just be able to see in the bay, on the far side of the bay there is a small station. So this is our Bird Island station. If any of you are budding zoologist students and would like a new career, we always advertise every year for people to go there for a year to help study and monitor all the wildlife on South Georgia. It's terribly badly paid, but there are quite a few perks to the job. And so from that centre, we have been monitoring, or BAS has been monitoring albatross, seals and whales and penguins for many, many years, and trying to understand the impact of past human activity on the island, but also in future of climate change. And one of the things that has been focused on South Georgia is about plastics. And there has been some terrible, terrible pictures. So I'm going to show you a couple of really awful pictures, warning, of plastics that have affected the animals on Bird Island in particular. So here's an albatross that has swallowed a hook from longline fishing, which is a long line that goes out with lots of hooks with squid on to catch fish. And the albatross dive down and they get the hook caught in their bills or in their beaks, and you can see that actual piece of plastic is caught in the flesh of the albatross. And here's a seal with fishing nets around it. There isn't actually much plastic debris on the beaches that I've saw in South Georgia, but many of the animals swim out to sea, and as you know, that's where much of the plastic is. So I think there's still a really big challenge to get rid of this debris, and in particular in the albatross. So here's Lucy.
I was on Bird Island for 2.5 years studying the albatross populations there. Now, the albatross adults, they go out to feed at sea, and when they're there, they sometimes pick up plastic when they're out at sea and other marine litter items. So they bring it back to their chicks, they'll feed it to their chicks, and then unfortunately their chicks will then regurgitate this plastic up just before they're about to fledge. So they'll bring up all the undigested material that's still left. Then this is where we would come and be able to see what plastic the chicks have ingested. And we would find items such as even a light bulb, package banding, food packaging, cling film. Everyday items that you would see would be being brought back to the nests, and we would see these poor chicks having to bring it up.
So it really is, Lucy was on Blue Planet 2, which was an amazing program that really highlighted the problem with plastic in the oceans. And so I think this is a problem that's going to carry on, but we really need to do something, particularly about fishing waste and about general plastic that's in the ocean, because it's even though South Georgia is remote and these animals are really in a really special place, they are still being affected by this terrible problem in the oceans. Now here's, so that's, if you like, a story of an unsustainable problem that we need to sort out. On South Georgia in the past, although it's remote, it has been affected by the activity of human beings. For many years, the seals were almost decimated. So initially there was sealing in the sealing activity in the 1700s, and nearly all the seals were decimated on South Georgia, and they've come back. The whales are a different story. And I noticed there is a poster about whales and whale recovery in the Arctic. And there is a story too in the Southern Ocean about whales. So this is a project which is based at BASS, at the British Antarctic Survey, working, as you can see, with some NGOs and science funding, and is to look at whale research in South Georgia. So this is a picture of South Georgia, quite dramatic, and you can see there's a small, what looks like a small town down here. This is Grytviken. And in the, so from 1700 till about the mid-1960s, this was the site of a massive, massive whaling industry. And on South Georgia, there were many whaling stations. And so thousands of whales were captured here, and for everything from their oil, this was of course before petroleum oil, so whale oil, bone meal, and in the end every part of the whale was used. And what's left now are these whaling stations, several of them, which are just rusting hulks. In many of these stations you can't visit because there's so much asbestos and dangerous buildings here that they must be left. And if there are any social scientists here, there's a really interesting conundrum here about what you do with these whaling stations. There's a really good research program here. So some of the people, the Norwegians who actually were whalers in South Georgia first, they have a process they like benign decay. So they want the whaling stations to just decay naturally as the memory of the whaling decays. But these buildings are unsafe, they're polluting, and they're an eyesore, and they're a danger to people and to animals. So the other option is to go in and take them out, or to try and renovate them for tourists. So there's a big challenge here about what you do with these whaling stations. Some of them they're sort of artistic in a way. These used to be full of whale oil, and the processing plants are quite horrific. And here you can see an old whaling ship. It's quite historic, the whaling in South Georgia. And you can see the harpoon gun there, and the crow's nest right at the top where they spotted the whales. And when they were whaling, there were hundreds of thousands of whales around these very fertile bays. But the trouble is, the whales are coming back, and there are lots of projects now to see how the whales are recovering. And the question is, really, are the whales going to be able to recover fully? So there you can see the sepia photo of a large whale, humpback whale, I think, with some of the whalers standing on it. They had an amazing job pulling these whales up with great big flensing knives, great big sharp knives, cutting the flesh away, boiling up the oil. It was quite a horrific place to live. South Georgia is generally very cold and damp, and there are stories about how the bays were red with blood, and the smell of rotting whale you could smell for miles away. And then on the other picture you can see much more modern whaling ships, and the whaling only finished in the 60s, so it really did carry on for quite a long time. So what these projects are trying to do is to understand why South Georgia is important for whales. They're trying to understand if the whales are going to come back, and in particularly by studying the krill, which is really their main food source. And here you can see the really stark data about whaling. So if you look up the left-hand side, you can see we're talking about number of individual whales in the tens of thousands. And the red line at the bottom is the whaling activity. And in 1910, there was a particularly strong pulse of whaling, and they really did go hard at trying to get as many humpback whales as possible. And you can see the impact on the humpback whale population. It was just devastated, totally devastated. And then there were hardly any whales left around South Georgia. So in a very short time, they went from nearly 30,000 whales to almost zero. And you can see where the whaling stopped in about 1965. And now gradually, thanks to the scientists who are monitoring it, the whale population is beginning to recover. And the challenge is to understand whether it really is going to establish the ecosystem that was there before, or whether or not there really was a lot of damage done. So humpbacks are one of the population of whales. There's also southern white whales and blue whales there as well. And when I was there, we stopped on a nice sunny day and there were whales blowing all around us. So there were hundreds of humpbacks in the water. Fabulous. So what these projects do is they are looking at the logging books from all the whaling expeditions all the way through history to try and find the numbers. And you really can see a really sharp decline in the whale numbers just from their logbooks, which is a horrible story. But this project is also going out looking at modern whales. So you can see up there on the right, you can see they're surveying the whales. They look at the whale blowholes, and then they also take photos because you can recognize them from their tails. And they're now taking samples, they're tagging the whales, and they're taking samples of whales so that they can get a DNA record. You have to be pretty robust to do this project, but you can see there's a little boat, there's a little Zodiac boat in the typical waters. This is a nice day in South Georgia, and you can see it's pretty rough, and somebody's got to stand on that viewing platform to look for whale blows and to study and photograph the whales. It's not for everyone, and it's definitely not for me. So the big question is whether or not the whales will come back. So they probably will get to a sustainable level in the future. But the good story from around South Georgia and the Antarctic is about sustainable management of the fishing. As I mentioned, around Antarctica, there are very good, cold, fertile waters, and there are a lot of really good fish around there. And there are many countries that want to fish around South Georgia. So there's lots of fish there, lots of fish to catch. You can see on the right, there's a colleague of mine, and he's holding an Antarctic toothfish. This is a giant fish. They are very distinctive in the Southern Ocean. I don't know if you can see with the sunlight, but over there, the guy who's on the bottom picture, the guy with the orange trousers, he is holding a fish that's bigger than himself. These toothfish are very distinctive in this region. You can see they grow very long, 2 meters or more. They live to a grand old age, 50 years or more. They don't do much. They just sit on the bottom. We have one in our aquarium in Cambridge, and it just kind of sits around. It doesn't move very much. It eats every now and then, but it just sits around. But these fish, there are two species, Patagonian toothfish and an Antarctic toothfish. And they're quite unusual because they have antifreeze in their blood or antifreeze instead of blood. So the Antarctic toothfish has no red blood cells, it just has antifreeze, and that's why it's so slow. It doesn't want to move very much. Patagonian toothfish lives around South Georgia, and that is part of a catch. It's, as I'll show you, it's a sustainable catch now. It's sold as Chilean sea bass. If you ever see it in the markets, it's very expensive. It is sustainable, and it's the best tasting fish I've ever eaten. So it really is quite exceptional. But all of these fish in the Southern Ocean are part of this quite complicated ecosystem that relies on each other. And so the important thing about sustainability is you don't just work on one thing, you have to understand the interdependency of the whole ecosystem and any impact man has on attacking just one of those parts of that ecosystem. And so on this shows the food web in Antarctica. It starts off at the bottom with the phytoplankton or the marine algae, and then they feed the krill. And then the krill is really vital around Antarctica for everything from the fish, from the penguins, from the seals, from the whales. It's all a very complicated food web. And now what's happening is the fishing is taking out a lot of krill. There's some countries that like krill tablets, so that because it's got a lot of omega-3, and this now is the main target for a lot of fishing. We need to make sure that's sustainable because it's feeding all the rest of that food web. And a lot of scientists have tried to understand how long it will take for some of these ecosystems to re-establish once they've been disturbed. So you can see here, there's the sealing that happened in the early days and the whaling there. And you can see it takes probably over 200 years to re-establish the balance of a sustainable ecosystem. So we have to be very careful what we do with the fishing. So around Antarctica, there is a really good governance policy. So Antarctica doesn't belong to anyone. Lots of nations work there, lots of nations fish around Antarctica. And as part of the Antarctic Treaty System, they formed a body called CAMLAR, the Commission for Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And as part of the Antarctic Treaty System, 25 countries have signed up. They all fish around Antarctica. And it's a conservation body. And what happens is every year in October in Hobart, there's a 2-week meeting when all the fishing companies that fish in the Southern Ocean, they meet up with the scientists, many scientists from Bass, who study all the fish stocks, the breeding grounds, the numbers of whales, the numbers of krill. They all meet together and they decide on where they should fish, because we don't want them to fish in the breeding grounds. We certainly don't want them to fish in the breeding grounds of the krill, and where those fish stocks are suitable that they are allowed to fish. And hopefully at the end of that, they're quite tricky meetings because, of course, there's economics involved in it. But at the end of it, what comes out of the end is sustainable fishing in this area. So it's a really great thing, and it's a really great case study of how to do something as large as this, a multinational organization, or a multinational body that can do fishing sustainably. Now, a really critical, important part of this is the science that generates the data to understand how to make the fishing sustainable. And I can't stress this enough. So there is a scientific committee that knows where the breeding grounds are, they know what the fish stocks are. Some of the scientists go on the fishing boats, they find out what's going on, what's being caught, the levels of catch, where the fish are breeding, where they're moving to and from, how climate change and ocean temperatures are changing the distribution of the fish. And they present scientific evidence to the CAMLAR meeting. And if there's no data from a certain area, then there's no fishing. So when this works well, it works exceptionally well. Except, of course, there are examples of illegal fishing, and this is one of the big problems. So around South Georgia, one of the things that the fishing group, CAMLAR, but also the South Georgia government, slightly different, they have so much good data, they are able to protect South Georgia. So all those fabulous animals I showed you, the birds, the whales, the penguins, they are protected to some extent by having a marine protected area around South Georgia. But a key thing is that within this area, you can see the marine protected areas there in green, there is fishing allowed. So sustainable fishing is an important part of a marine protected area, because then the scientists have understood where the sustainable areas are and where it can be well regulated. And South Georgia has an excellent reputation for protecting the fish in the water. It has fishing inspectors like Paula here. They go onto the ships, the fishing ships. They look after the fishing licenses. They are good friends with the fishermen, and they inspect the catch, and they help the regulation to make it properly sustainable. And this is how I went to South Georgia on the Pharos, which is South Georgia's fisheries patrol ship, and that will patrol the South Georgia waters to ensure that the fishing is done sustainably, but also that there's no illegal fishing. And they will chase after illegal fishing boats if they find them. And in fact, when we went down, there was a call when we were getting close to South Georgia that another ship had found a buoy in the water that looked like an illegal fishing buoy. And so instead of going to South Georgia, we carried on with my seasickness for another day and went to see if we could find this illegal fishing buoy. And a fishing buoy, it's just a small buoy in the water, but what is attached to it is a long line with great big metal hooks on it, usually with a piece of squid on the end to attract the toothfish and other fish. And those long lines can go for as long as 15 kilometers through the sea, catching fish. And so illegal fishing boats can come in and put those in, and you have to be very careful to find them. So we couldn't find this boy, actually, in the end. And the South Georgia's fishery protection is also helped by HMS Clyde, which helps with the fisheries patrol. So the fishing is very sustainable. But CAMLA also, in another way, protects some of the animals. So it protects the seabirds, particularly the albatross. So when I showed you at the very beginning that picture of an albatross with the plastic in its beak, hopefully there is less and less, well, we know there is less and less now, because it was a huge problem. So the middle picture is the view behind a fishing boat. And as soon as these long lines go through from the fishing boat, they just put these long lines of hooks out for kilometers, baited for fish. And you can see the albatross just swoop in straight away. They're very curious, and they know there's bits of squid on these hooks. And they swoop in straight away, and then they catch the hook in their stomach or in their bills. And you can see on the far right, you can see an albatross which has been pulled down and it has drowned. And there was a really big problem about albatross drowning and being killed by these long-line fishing. But CAMLA brought in some agreed, by consultation, agreed that they would change the way they put the lines out. They changed the bait. They changed the time they went fishing. They fished at night rather than during the day. And the albatross have been saved. And far fewer albatross now are caught by these long lines, apart from the illegal fishing boats. So this is a real success story of sustainability, both for the fish and for the albatross. And now the albatross are happy in their isolated paradise and sitting on their nests there, raising their eggs as we were there. So I think even though this South Georgia is an island in the middle of nowhere, it has a really good examples of how you can look after an island and you can have sustainable activity around it as well. Thank you very much.